afternoon. I'm Jessica Berman. I'm the director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities, and I want to welcome you all to the second event in our Humanities Forum series, panel on constructing heritage. Before we get into the specifics of this panel, which is also co-sponsored by the American Studies Department, I also want to invite you to attend the next couple of events in the Humanities Forum series co-sponsored by the Drescher Center. On Wednesday, tomorrow at 4 o'clock in this same place, the Medieval and Early Modern Studies Colloquium event will take place. We have a speaker, Anthony Bale, Professor of Medieval Studies at Birkbeck College of London, speaking on race and its medieval prehistories, Jews and stereotypes in Norwich and London, 1233. So that actually should have some overlap with this conversation today and should be a really interesting event. I also want to welcome you to the next event that's listed on this handy, beautiful, bright green flyer that is available in the back of the room if you want one. And that is at 4 p.m. in the gallery on Tuesday, March 4th, The Living Edge, Delights and Dilemmas of the Chesapeake Bay, Tom Horton and Dave Harp, environmental journalists, who will speak about the Chesapeake Bay, which is the country's largest estuarine system whose drainage basin touches 6 states. Tom Horton and Dave Harp are two of the nation's best-known environmental journalists, and this should be a great opportunity to speak with them about the work they're doing on behalf of the Chesapeake Bay. So welcome and thanks for coming. Today we have a panel organized by Michelle Stefano, who will introduce the other speakers. She is folklorist in residence in the Department of American Studies. In October 2010, she completed her doctoral dissertation within the International Center for Cultural and Heritage Studies at Newcastle University. Drawing from the fields of anthropology, sociology, and more specifically, cultural policy and heritage studies, her PhD examined multiscalar conceptualizations of intangible cultural heritage, its expression at the local level, and the ways in which it can be effectively safeguarded by those who practice, change, and embody it. She's currently also program coordinator of Maryland Traditions at the Maryland State Arts Council, a program that seeks to sustain urban, suburban, rural, old, and new cultural expressions within the state. So welcome, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the Drescher Center, and particularly Bev Bickle, who's been very instrumental in developing not only this forum, but hopefully this ongoing series of conversations at UMBC centered around heritage museum issues, the making of it and the uses of it. So I also want to thank our panelists. We will first be hearing from, after I lay some groundwork, Mario Santo Domingo, who is based in the psychology department here at UMBC. And then we'll be hearing from Ashley Minner, who is highly active within the Baltimore American Indian Center in East Baltimore, and also the liaison to the Indian Education Program of Baltimore City Public Schools. And then James Early, the Director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, will be leading us into discussions. So I thank you all for coming and for making the trip up from DC. So I just want to bring some context to the following presentations to talk a little bit about the heritage discourse, particularly outside of the United States, within the burgeoning disciplines of heritage and museum studies. These are programs generally at the graduate level, MA, PhD programs that are budding up throughout the world. Long-standing history within Northern Europe, but now we're starting to see more of this heritage discourse, and particularly these programs in Asia. Australia also has a long-standing history, Canada, etc. So what exactly is this heritage concept? What is this general consensus that or category that everyone is discussing and debating? And then I will bring it to more recent developments, this movement for critical heritage studies. We always have to get critical about things, but before we do, I'd like to, of course, talk about the basics. So when heritage, the word comes to your mind, what sorts of things do you associate it with? Please. Jenny. Culture. Any other words? There's no wrong or right answer. I think one of the main points of our panel today. Tradition, absolutely. Ethnicity, yes. We have heritage is very much tied and intertwined with our own ways that we define ourselves, personal identity, but also more collective. Struggle, very interesting, absolutely. Yeah, please. Roots, sure, absolutely. Your ancestry, genealogy, etc. Yes. Cultural knowledge, yes, absolutely. So yes, there's a diversity of ways we can define and think about heritage, which again is one of our main points today during this forum. However, heritage there is a general, as I was saying, on international level, there is a general consensus of what it does mean. There are some set categories. So I'm just going to take you through some examples of what this concept generally is known for. So obviously, material culture. There are over 56,000 museums in the world. You could argue that's a rather popular human endeavor to collect things, protect them, preserve them, educate, disseminate, interpret what all this stuff is. Pitt Rivers Museum, one of the oldest, as we think of modern museums today in the world, this idea of taking objects, things from original source contexts, bringing them into the artificial museum setting, stripping through that process these original meanings and values, and then trying to recreate and approach that context within the museum setting. So you generally have your ubiquitous didactic panels that tell you about the things that are on display. You could also use similar objects to create the context of what this material culture is and where it comes from, what manifestation it is of cultural beliefs and expressions. Or you can also give it the art treatment, as I like to call it, this idea, particularly with ethnographic, human-made objects, where you strip them almost of all their cultural meanings and values, and you value, first and foremost, the aesthetics of these objects. So you generally see this in art museums up till today, and you have the small little panel of information usually telling you about the wealthy person who donated it. Heritage also includes sites, so built, immovable, human-made, manifestations of cultural beliefs, et cetera, that need to be protected and preserved in situ. So obviously we have a really good example right here. But then we also can think of historic city centers. So this is Edinburgh, capital of Scotland. The entire city center is considered a World Heritage Site. You could imagine the rules and regulations if you were to live in one of these pretty apartments. Not to say that other parts of the city aren't pretty, but nonetheless, changing these buildings, et cetera, would be very difficult. This is a site of preservation. And then we have large swaths of land throughout the world that are protected, valorized. They're given special importance. Does anyone know what's depicted here? Shh, panelists. Come on, former students. Gettysburg. So battlefield heritage is a very big subcategory within the heritage concept. To some, this is a field with a highway going through it. To others, in the know, it is valued above being just a natural spot on Earth. And in recent years, the heritage concept has expanded to also include cultural landscapes. Generally, in the literature, we're talking about indigenous cultural landscapes, waterways. These are places that aren't human-made. Nonetheless, they are imbued with cultural values and uses. So we have Uluru here smack in the middle of central Australia, very important in the heritage discourse in the late 1970s, early 80s. Recognition of this as a World Heritage Site really opened up the pathway to understanding heritage is also cultural landscapes. And I'll get into that whole process. And then in very recent years, we're starting to see a dematerialization of the heritage concept to include intangible cultural heritage. So here we have a very local tradition off the coast of Belgium in East Dunkirk. This is shrimp harvesting by horseback. This has been recognized as intangible cultural heritage. Now, don't get this confused with living traditions, cultural expressions, and beliefs. Intangible cultural heritage is a very specific term that comes from a very specific convention in 2003, enacted internationally in 2006, coming out of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. This category of heritage, again, has helped to dematerialize and take us a little bit away from the traditional emphasis on tangible, immovable, grand, beautiful heritage that generally is concentrated in Europe. Nonetheless, there is this idea that we are constructing these categories. And just to take it a little bit wider, UNESCO recently recognized, so I keep using the word recognize, keep that in mind, the Mediterranean diet as an intangible cultural element of humanity that needs to be preserved for the future. Now, this is a beautiful salad, a Greek salad perhaps. Nonetheless, this is an idea that intangible cultural heritage is transnational and can correspond to what I would argue are nuanced, complex, multifarious traditions throughout the whole Mediterranean region reduced to one category. Nonetheless, this is our humanity, heritage of our humanity, excuse me, all these words. In recent years as well, we've been starting to recognize cultural and memories, collective memories, as also fitting within this idea of living heritage, a heritage of today that's been passed down and we've inherited in the present. I've been doing work with Professor Bill Shoebridge here at UMBC and students, of course, that thank you for coming, on the importance and significance of the Sparrows Point Steel Mill here in Dundalk and the memories, the stories of those who embody this significance and the values of this steel mill, how it shaped the lives of thousands of steelworkers and associated personnel for 125 years, one of the largest mills in the world, steel mills. So this idea of also collective memory, how we commemorate, memorialize events, people, etc., how we learn to remember things we never experienced. So this is all part of the heritage discourse. But what really needs to be emphasized, although we think of heritage as a product to be consumed, as we see in over 56,000 museums in the world, these are things that we learn about and then we leave, but heritage really is a process, should be understood as a process. And I am borrowing from Lowenthal, 1985, who really brought this idea to the fore that heritage is all about the present. It says more about the present, our desires, our decision-making in the present, than it says about the past at all. And so heritage takes this wealth of information that we've inherited today from history, all this information about where we came from, etc., and selects it in the present for preservation for the future. So within the heritage discourse, you always find this, well, you often find, the rhetoric of we need to preserve for future generations, future publics, the younger generations, etc. So it's this idea of taking excerpts of history in the present and protecting it for the future. But as this forum has been convened around the idea of constructing heritage, this is a highly political process. You would imagine, or I would think the question comes to your mind, who gets to decide what we select and protect and interpret and disseminate in these institutions of heritage making? So we will hopefully be discussing that a lot more in just a moment. And the selection process, again, goes back to the museums. They're one of the biggest institutions in the world where heritage is made, shaped as a concept, promulgated, designated, recognized, valorized, etc. This is the Pitt Rivers Museum today, or in recent years. So some joke in the museum world, this is a museum of a museum. You can see how, museum history from the traditional approaches to, again, interpreting and disseminating heritage, and particularly material culture. Nonetheless, those traditional approaches, again, of excising cultural, physical manifestations from original and source context, bringing them into the artificial museum setting, is something we still do today, whether it's in an art gallery exhibition or your science museums, et cetera, a whole plethora of different types of museums. But we praise the aesthetic values of objects, particularly in the art context with ethnographic, and we're given very small information, interpretation, context, if you can see those small white text panels. So these traditional museum practices are still continuing today. And this is all based on selection. So going back to UNESCO, just to give you an example, again, very obvious one of how heritage is shaped. Since World War II, UNESCO's establishment, the protection of cultural heritage, coming out of war, the destruction of Dresden as an example, et cetera, a group got together and realized we need to protect these things again for the future. And so couple of years later, in the early 1970s, we have the Convention for Conserving and Safeguarding World Heritage. A little later, this idea of natural cultural landscapes was added into the convention. Nonetheless, this shapes this idea of world heritage, heritage for all. And one of the main mechanisms for promulgating this notion of world heritage is a list. So here you're looking at a list of all the World Heritage sites, recent up to date, almost 1,000 sites in the world. If you looked at this map in the 1980s up through the 1990s, most of those dots would be in Europe. So there's been an imbalance. Many have argued around the world, so now there are more sites, cultural, natural, that are recognized outside of Europe. Nonetheless, this idea of nominating at the national level sites for this valorizing recognition, the stamp of UNESCO, of course, it's very prestigious for national governments, and there is no guarantee of increased income through tourism, though many of these places, of course, become destination spots. And this same idea of constructing categories of heritage has been extended to intangible cultural heritage. There's a convention, as I mentioned a little bit ago, in 2003, enacted 2006. At the moment, there are, I think, a little over 150 nations on the planet that have signed on to this convention as a promise to protect living cultural traditions throughout their national territories. And again, this is all pushed forward through a list, very prestigious to have an element of intangible cultural heritage, the shrimp harvesting, the Mediterranean diet, to be on these international lists. But of course, if we get critical, the question is, how does that at all safeguard these traditions? So just, I'm almost done, but this idea of heritage studies is very broad and very interdisciplinary. Of course, it's looking at archaeological sites, the management of heritage, tourism comes into that, the destruction of archaeological sites, all sorts of heritage sites, historic homes, et cetera, cultural landscapes. Immovable heritage. Museums is obviously a main point of where heritage studies inquiries are focused, memories, commemoration, et cetera, and also now into the more cultural practices and in the intangible, which you could imagine a strong overlap with many fields and disciplines, particularly with intangible heritage, the field of anthropology. But when we get more critical, which is a movement in recent years, not to say it's new, but we're looking at this power relations within the heritage sector. So there's the heritage field with theories, and then there's obviously a practicing heritage sector of museum professionals, site professionals, et cetera. So this question of who's deciding is really central to the critical heritage studies movement. Also, as demonstrated just here at the forum, this the diversity of heritage definitions and interpretations really need to be taken into account. Is it really a top-down understanding of heritage, or can it be more from the bottom up and community and local level derived? Access to these processes, how can we increase access? How can we begin to democratize more the heritage making and usage mechanisms? And also to recognize that heritage doesn't lie within museums only and heritage sites only, demarcated by fences and gates and fees. It also has broader connections to other contexts, socioeconomic, environmental, et cetera. And also that this field of inquiry is applicable to many social issues of today, poverty, environmental issues, et cetera. And I hope Mario will be talking a little bit about a frontier within heritage studies to look at the benefits of culture and working within the heritage process, particularly at the local level, and the connections to well-being and mental health. And so one example, generally within, as I mentioned, with traditional museology, museum practices, it's that top-down expert. The museum is the authority. You walk in, everything in there is gospel. But for a couple of decades now, there's been movements for alternative museology, where it's generally bottom-up. community-based, community-run, or at least collaboration with museum and heritage professionals where authority is shared. So here's Ashley on the stoop of the Baltimore American Indian Center, which you'll be talking about with, I think, some of your favorite museum goers, right? And we'll also be hearing from Mario on his work, very instrumental in getting off the ground a community-run museum heritage project, whatever you want to call it. It's a process in Morong, the Philippines. But yes, it's a very interdisciplinary field. It's a list of fields and disciplines that heritage pulls from, methodological toolkits as well, from anthropology, ethnography, etc. And also, these are disciplines and fields that can also contribute to the heritage discourse. And just I'm going to end on some recent developments. Since 2011, a group of international scholars and professionals in the sector have come together to really promote a more critical understanding of heritage, these processes, et cetera. So the Association of Critical Heritage Studies was established in 2012. It had a launch conference in Gothenburg, Sweden, about 400 participants at that conference, which is a sizable number, taking into account this small subfield of critical heritage studies. I teamed up with James and Meredith Holmgren at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage to launch the U.S. chapter of this association that you're all welcome to become a member of. Just email me. It's still getting off the ground, but forums like this are, help to begin this conversation, particularly within the U.S. context. So I think I will turn it over to Mario now and take us to the local level in the Philippines. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I'm actually not sure whether I represent the local or the international, but what I'm sure about is that I am a barefoot heritage worker. I do not have formal training like maybe most of you here, but I started this project as a private citizen. I didn't even think that I would be speaking to any audience since we started this. But then because I'm an academic, I am a community psychologist. That's what my training was on. But I realized that a lot of things that I have been doing are very, very relevant to this field. And so today I'll talk to you about what I did last summer, literally. Okay. I went home to the Philippines and thought about starting something that I've been thinking about since 7 or 8 years ago, but it was very, very difficult to do. And this was to establish a historical society in my own hometown, in a community where I was born. I could not establish a psychological society. It sounds weird. But I thought that there is something that I can do to promote what I have been teaching, which is community well-being. And so the talk that I'm gonna give to you today is basically a descriptive rendition of my experience. Feel free to apply your theories in cultural analysis. Feel free to be critical of what we are doing. As I've said, we just started last year, and so this is a work in progress. So this is the politics and psychology of community-based heritage work, the case of Likas Morong in the Philippines. I'll talk about what those words mean. First, my observations and observations of people I work with. And these are basically the foundations of what we were doing. We observed that there's a disintegration of traditional communities due to westernization, out-migration, and influx of capital in many, many communities around the world. And we have observed it firsthand in our own community. There's the failure of basic local institutions like school, church, local government to preserve the patrimony of small communities. There's the erosion of citizen initiatives due to top-down governance and paternalistic structures. cultural obliteration is associated with environmental destruction and vice versa. And finally, there's the disembedding of economics from social relationships. So, since we have observed that these things have been happening, and since I'm a community psychologist with a concern on community well-being, what should I do? I thought, since my field also deals with citizen participation, then perhaps I should do something about involving citizens to promote well-being in my own community. My research involves the study of sense of community and place identity. But what about heritage? How can I actually fit it into the picture? Okay, let me draw two more squares. Okay, I thought that perhaps we can start studying and practicing local history. At the same time, promote activities that will encourage the practice of common heritage, you know? And this is very much akin to building a museum. And then I connected it to collective memory, which is also a psychological, I'm sure many fields are also studying it. And then I connected all those squares. We're very fond of this model, so pardon me. And so I thought that since we have this idea, let's do something. But first, let me introduce where I did this. Perhaps most of you are familiar with the Philippines. It's in Southeast Asia, and it's an archipelagic nation composed of more than 7,000 islands. And Morong, which is my community, is located in the largest island, which is Luzon. It was founded in 1578, or named in 78. It's headed by a town mayor, and there are 8 villages. Okay. It's primarily an agricultural town with rich natural resources. Okay, so a lot of rice fields, people fish. Okay, but at the same time, it's also the center of education in the province. Since Spain was in the Philippines for more than 300 years, Americans were there for more than 30 years, and the Japanese were there for about 4 years. It has a very rich tradition, okay, from those different cultures. Okay, we have like Spanish churches, buildings that's designed from the time that the Spaniards were there. We have old bridges, but this bridge was actually destroyed during World War II when the Japanese forces were advancing and the Americans actually tried to prevent them. And so it's not existent any longer. It is relatively small. It has a population of 52,000, and it still has many culture and traditions that are practiced year in and year out. Okay, during Lenten season, the Holy Week, during the Feast of the Dead, and all kinds of traditions are still there. You can see here there are signages here with the letter R. You know, in that particular community, when people speak Tagalog, they change the D's into R's. Very peculiar. Okay, something that's unique, and it has retained that particular practice, linguistic practice. However, because of all the changes, okay, the influx of capital from Manila and from all places from around the world, a lot of things have been happening, including the destruction of the environment. Look at the flood. I didn't observe this. I didn't see this when I was growing up. It happened only since a few years ago. So, as a community psychologist, I thought that since I've been dealing with the creation of settings, okay, to promote a community well-being, perhaps that's what I should do. So I initiated the establishment of a local historical society, which we called Lipunang Pangkasaysayan ng Morong. Lipunan is society, kasaysayan is history, and of Morong. We call it Likas Morong. Likas also means native. In our language, it also means nature. So it has very rich connotations. At the same time, the creation of a living heritage museum, which is the physical setting that will go hand in hand with the social setting that we're creating. So we call it the Museong Pambayan ng Morong. Bayan means town or community. But I've said it's very difficult to do. At first, we laid down our basic beliefs that it's important to understand and study the history of one's community, to be able to promote it and to be able to transmit it to the current generation and to the future generations. We collected a small group of committed and talented individuals. There were only 4 when I started this. One is my niece. Another one is an artist, an old politician, and a young politician. It's very important. My niece was very, very important because of the connection, family connection. And then we've been sending each other messages of inspiration, like this quote, "Never doubt, the small group of thoughtful and committed citizens can change the world," by Margaret Mead. I thought it was very effective. The technology was very useful too. Facebook. Without Facebook, it would have been very difficult to communicate and to exchange ideas and to push, and pull people, from different directions. Now, the first task was, of course, to identify a space for the museum. We were fortunate that at that time, last year, that we were thinking about it, an old building was vacated by the local government because they built a new one, at the outskirts of the town. And so we thought that maybe we should get it, we should occupy it. They didn't want to give it to us because it's a big building. The rumor was they were going to make it into a commercial establishment because it will be very profitable. It will be at the middle of the town. So, and then it's really, really quite dilapidated. It's dirty. It's being used for small-time prostitution, gambling, and so we didn't have any resources. So we thought that since we have the commitment and the broom and the trash cans and the mop, we should just clean it. Go there and clean it. And that's what we did. We just did it every day. Day in and day out, we were cleaning it, until the day that it was fully cleaned. But it's not ours. So what's going to happen? Well, we started lobbying for that space. We planned, we wrote the city council or the town council, and we thought that maybe we should start building the museum. We had a plan. This is another of those quotes, and we invited people to come. Bring something from their garages, from their kitchens, from their houses. But at the same time, we're advocating for it. This is a meeting between the mayor and me, and then expatriates from the United States. They were very, very important too, because they're supporters. We asked our small numbers, small membership to come wearing white, and because that was also the election period. The politicians were very sensitive to numbers. We asked right there and then if he would sign a memorandum of agreement making the Likas Morong as the steward of the building so that we can make it a museum. He said, no, it's difficult. But he wasn't saying, no, don't do what you're doing. So we still did what we thought we should do. We prepared everything, and we set the inauguration of the museum and of the organization on April 5th. Okay, we even prepared an oral history book, okay, to launch then. So this was the museum, okay. So we thought, okay, let's make it so beautiful that the mayor and the town council and the people will say, oh, let's just keep it, okay. But then the mayor, okay, and these are some of the material culture artifacts. We got paintings, photographs, murals from many different people who came to say, here, display our work. This is a local hero and the cuisine. Okay, so the food that the local chefs are fond of cooking. Then we also prepared some exhibit commemorating people's cooperation during a typhoon, archives. And since it's a living heritage museum, we also gave space to music, to dance, and to many different aspects of history. Here we also gave an award to a local historian. This was during the inauguration, the signing of the memorandum of agreement, and the mayor signed it. Okay, he was running as the vice mayor. He was the mayor. He was running as the vice mayor. I'm sure he didn't want to lose by not signing a memorandum of agreement. Okay, and from then on, we continued working, doing storytelling, history storytelling. Okay, every month we have this we call huntahan, talking about pieces of history, and you can notice that there's food every time because we also talk about local food. Okay, it's both a motivating factor, okay? Because people come, they want to taste what people prepare, okay? And we also started getting out of the building, okay? We also occupy the plaza. See, we labeled the building, Likas Morong, and our artists prepared something to show the people in the plaza. Okay. So this is the new mayor, and we brought the new mayor to another town who has a historical society, so we began networking too. Okay. Finally, I'll just talk about, show you the challenges that we had, and maybe this is very familiar with many of you. There has been a traditional emphasis on material culture versus living heritage, because there are people who are trained museologists in the town, you know, and so they want to insist on displaying artifacts. Okay, there are different versions of history and interpretation of heroism. You know, our town hero was a soldier fighting for America, and he died in France. So many, a small handful of people were saying he shouldn't be the hero. The hero should be someone who was here and fought for the community. But then we're open to all those interpretations because we're still starting, and it's really quite a struggle, okay, to just stick with one story, okay? Perhaps we will not stick with one story, because many stories are valuable. Stories, there are stories that some people prefer not to present to the public. This is another challenge because we want to be as inclusive as much as possible, but still now most of our members come from the poblacion, okay, from the middle, the center of the town. But there's the periphery that we want also to embrace so that they can contribute to the development of the society and the museum. Okay, the monopoly of the more educated and those with high purchasing power. The existence of an official 25-year-old local cultural organization. They don't want us to have anything to do with culture. Really very difficult, okay? The local leadership and the allocation of resources, the limitations, okay? And of course the state. They want all of transactions to have receipts, you know, official receipts. How can you get an official receipt from a vendor selling like 100 peso worth of rice cake. It's really a big challenge for us. And finally, just additional pictures here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mario. So now we will hear from Ashley Minner. Bring us to Baltimore, please.
Okay. How's everybody feeling? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to take you to Southeast Baltimore City, and I'm going to speak to you from my own experience. I'm a community artist, visual artist. I also work with young people. My day job is with the Title VII Indian Education Program of Baltimore City Public Schools, and I'm a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. My presentation's entitled Telling Our Story. I'm going to start by telling you a story. These are the young ladies of the Native American After School Art Program, and they are pretty much geniuses. They've been in their program since they were 2, some of them. They write grants, they get funding. They do work for social justice through visual art in the neighborhood and beyond. And if you're familiar with Upper Fells Point community or Fells Point in general, where the Baltimore American Indian Center is located, you know that there's been a somewhat recent influx of the Latino population, and with different races in any given area, there's racial tension sometimes. So one day the girls were complaining something about school, the Spanish people this, the Spanish people that, and I said, guess what? Do you know the Spanish people are also indigenous? Y'all are cousins? And they said, no, we're not. We're definitely not. And I said, don't tell me that, Miss Ash. And I said, why aren't you? Well, they speak Spanish. And I said, why do they speak Spanish? And we went through the whole history of how they're living in a post-colonial society. And I also asked, why do you speak English? You know, so going back, by the way, we're cousins, and this is the time we're operating in today. But they're all, you can look at them, you can see we have a variety of skin tones, textures of hair, and we're all members of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. Members of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina are from Robeson County and some surrounding counties in southern North Carolina, almost at the South Carolina line. We're mixed with several different native peoples as well as African and European ancestry. We come from, as you can see, the swamp mostly and farmland. Our families basically were all farmers. It's a tobacco field that was the main cash crop. One of our major accomplishments was that almost as a result of Jim Crow in the Jim Crow South, Indians were forced to form their own school system. They couldn't go to school with African American children or white children. So their tribal school, one of them that they built, eventually became part of the University of North Carolina, and it's University of North Carolina at Pembroke today. This is a typical family gathering of Lumbees in North Carolina in the 1940s. My mom and my grandfather and my uncle are actually in this picture. My grandfather is the good-looking, dark-skinned guy in the back. And he was a soldier in World War II. And many of the veterans from World War II decided that they found that they could make a living easier in Baltimore City. So you can see the contrast in landscape. In the 1950s, they began to come up to Baltimore and settled down in Southeast on South Broadway and East Baltimore Street in this neighborhood, all around the park. And this is what happens when Lumbees come to Baltimore City. This is Mr. Slim Hunt and I when we had our powwow some years ago in Patterson Park. Slim was one of the first to come up. And the first thing that, as the community grew, the first thing they did together was form a church, because Lumbees are profoundly Southern Baptist. They have a whole association of only Indian Baptist churches. And then from the church, they decided they needed a way to talk about, share about their Indianness, beyond just the Indian church. And from the church grew the Baltimore American Indian Center. It started as culture class in the back of church, and eventually, almost right away, there was a museum component. Um, and as I say, we're all existing in this post-colonial society. Like the rest of the people, we ascribe to this cabinet of curiosities type model. We all know this is where museums come from. And it's interesting because that's where artifacts from our own ancestors were exoticized. But now we have built ourselves this beautiful space to showcase what we think is important to our people. And it's interesting because, like Mario was saying, different people would show up with things from their house, like, oh, I've just been waiting for y'all to get this together. I want to preserve this for our kids. And at the same time, we're trying to have committees, have boards that ascribe to the more academic model of what goes in a museum and an exhibition. This is when we first opened. So much has happened since then, but it's a pretty nice space in our building. But to speak also to the intangible culture, that's not the only way what we do is showcased and perpetuated. We have our seniors around the corner, our elders, and we do a lot of intergenerational things. That's just our way of living in the world. We have the Indian education program, through which 3 of our seniors work with young people. We honor traditions, borrow traditions, make new traditions as a group. This is a graduation ceremony where young people receive eagle feathers. One young lady graduated college and the other graduated high school that year. And we continue our agricultural heritage, even though we're in the city now. Lacrosse, if you didn't know, lacrosse is a Native American sport. Though was not played by Lumbees necessarily. It was more upstate New York into Canada. And here's James teaching some of the boys how to make fry bread, and that's not something Lumbees did either, but it's a part of Pan-Indian culture today, and we borrow from each other, and I'll go into that. Culture class, where you can learn how to dance and other traditions. And then that ends up at the powwow, which is probably an experience that a lot of people in the room have been to, where it's truly exhibition dancing. If you look at the guys on their side tabs, they have numbers because they're in a competition, and they win points, and then hopefully they win some money. Some of our kids from Baltimore have made a pretty decent living just doing powwows. So, and we do art, and this is some of my art, because most of my major work for the last 10 years has been in collaboration with my community. This is from the Exquisite Lumbees series, and if you remember the shots of the museum, some of these were hanging on the wall when we first opened. And it basically is a celebration of my generation. We're all about 30 now. But it also confounds stereotypes of what a Native American should look like, should be like, should wear. People have all kinds of funny ideas. I guess they get them from TV. But this is Dean. And the participants were asked to come to the studio wearing what they felt best in. Is the clothes he picked out. And the writing in the background is from him. And then this is Keith. And actually, Keith was the only one who chose to come in his regalia. We call it a regalia or suit of honor. And everybody else saw his picture later and like, oh, can I retake mine? But no. So, and then as another part of this project, I made a book, an Exquisite Corpse book, which Exquisite Corpse comes from the Surrealist movement, where people would have these art parties. Here we are back at the Underground Academy, where they would fold up a piece of paper and pass it around, and every person would draw on a different fold. And when you open it, you have this, like, composite drawing, monster drawing, Exquisite Corpse. Well, here we have headshots of all 30 of the Lumbee people who participated in the project, and you can kind of interchange features and make a whole new Lumbee, many new Lumbees. And this kind of to prove that we all have a look. Though we run the gamut of skin colors, hair textures, we can definitely always pick each other out. And this is the first incarnation of another project called Lumbee Legends, where, again, making our stories and our culture palatable to the art academy, giving it the art treatment. But I made some artist books of stories told by our elders, and you can come, is another place it was displayed. Come listen to the story and look through photos of the person's life. And this was a Maryland Traditions project we did with Michelle at the Baltimore Museum of Industry. As I say, the Lumbees came to Baltimore to work. Almost all of my grandparents' generation was employed by General Motors or some factory in the city. So this exhibition, and the great thing is most of them are still living. They get to come see themselves be honored in this museum setting. And they had a panel discussion and got to say their own piece. And then most recently, we did a traditions grant about our gospel singing, which we do have a distinct form of gospel singing. And South Broadway Baptist Church is the Indian church in Baltimore. If you ever want to check it out, it's practiced to this day here. So I wanted to emphasize that we've been pretty good about finding the space and taking the initiative to tell our own story. When you allow somebody else to tell your story for you, you might get a book title like this. And this is told by a member of our tribe who's actually Melinda Maynard Lowry. I think she's probably the leading scholar of our people. And her articulation of the fact that our tribe, our people, our culture hasn't been subtractive over the years. We've been inclusive. How do you take on the religion of your oppressor? How do you make English your own? Well, we did it. That's how she's explained it to the world. I think she did a really good job. Not as good as I just did. And then interestingly, there was an article just the other day in Indian Country Media Today, written by a Native American lady who a friend of hers actually referred to her as a breed or a half-breed. And she wrote this whole essay response on Indian racism, but it just speaks to our position within colonization, that it's a mental prison that draws no boundaries based on blood quantum or anything else. And all of the history, what we share is the history of our families having been ripped apart, our languages stolen, our cultures violently disrupted. And why should we trap ourselves in a prison of someone else's making? Because that's insane. So this is what we're teaching and talking about with the younger generation, what they're sharing with their peers, and coming to figure out that we are really all one big inclusive family and cousins somewhere down the line. And we're going to keep sharing our culture in our way and telling our story. The end.
So James, do you want to sit or stand?
Ooh, I think I better stand.
All right. So welcome, James Early.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Okay, good. I really want to speak kind of quickly, and Ms. Panfile is going to ensure that I do not overrun time. First of all, I want to say I am really, really pleased to be here. I've been to this campus now several times, and I do get an occasion to move about the United States and about the world pretty much, and occasionally I get a chance to be on a college campus. And while I've not been on the whole of this campus with the Drexler Center and with American Studies and language, culture, and there you go. I have to be more literate about language, literacy, and culture. I must say that I have really been inspired to be around what I like to call young colleagues in addition to your adult faculty. And I would really like for you to think about that construct, that you're not just students, you are our colleagues. And while it's obvious that this institution has a lot to offer you, that's why you have come, it is always not so obvious to us how much you have to offer us in the world in which you live. And that's, and one way of saying that is called agency, and I think you just heard rich and seen rich examples of agency, proactivity, protagonist, a term that we use in theater in the English-speaking world, but a term in Latin America that really is about self-actualization of citizenship, and I think we've heard some great examples. So I am really pleased to be back here. Another reason that I'm particularly pleased to be back here is that at the initiative of Dr. Michelle Stefano, a colleague whom I met at the Mid-Atlantic Association of Political Scientists, American Studies, and folklorists, and she was just coming back from Europe and said, you know, we ought to do something. And a year and a half, 2 years later, boy, did she bring something big for us to do. She brought back, as the official liaison to the United States, the International Association of Critical Heritage Studies. And so we had an opportunity at the Smithsonian Institution Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where I work as Director of Cultural Heritage Studies, to host the launching of that. The significance of that is that the Smithsonian Institution is a public trust, a term I'd like for you to think about. It's not just the world's largest museum complex of 19 museums, et cetera, but it is a public trust. It is not a federal agency. So as the public, citizen and or resident, particularly resident in this transnational world in which we live and where nationalisms and national identity are still quite significant, they are not the end all and be all. In fact, they begin to foreshadow where the future is coming. Just look at those of you who have familiar relationships in Guatemala and Costa Rica and Panama and Mexico, who through social media and cell phones are in touch with them and know your grandparents and so forth and so on. And you have these multiple loyalties. You belong here, you belong there. Not of my generation, who think, well, we belong here and you are from there. The world is changing and you are a key part of that. What we have done with Michelle's initiative is to begin a de facto series of engagements with the faculty and the students here that we will try to figure out what's the formalistic language to put on that. But I like to think that that's how culture and life operates. That is lived behavior. Really is always trying to extend itself beyond the categories of history that we put on previous lived behavior, if you follow what I'm saying. In the academic world, we like to talk about categories and language and terminology, and where do we inhabit? How do we exist in relationship to that? Well, we created it in the first place. We are the culture makers. Culture is not something out there. There are expressions of culture and heritage out there, but we are the language makers. We are the ones that determine, of all of the things in human history, from whatever our particular group is, what are we going to deal with from those who said, this is what we're leaving you and this is what you should be dealing with. We accept some of that and we transgress others of that, and in transgressing, from a critical point of view, we transform. So I would like for you to think about the construction of heritage as an act of the negotiation of power. Power, and some of you may have heard this little riff from me before, but it is a negotiation of the use of one's imagination, of how you want to envision the world relative to the world that you have been born into, that you inhabit, the traditions, customs, protocols, expectations that your parents and your community and your religious institutions and civic institutions put before you. You say, yes, I'm going to accept that, but particularly when you're a young adult, you say, you know, I'm really not going to deal with that. In fact, I'm going to invent something new, because we are cultural makers. It is not out there. And I think that's the first issue I want to put forth in acts of cultural politics constructing heritage. Heritage is not just constructed by the powerful, that is the state, and I would ask you to examine the history of the evolution of the state relative to citizens, because we focus a lot on the transnational major institution of cultural heritage formulation, which is the United Nations Educational and Scientific Organization, who are political representatives voted in one way or another by citizens who then take on a role of themselves, and they say they're doing that in our name. But what you have just heard are two, I think, really, really powerful presentations of self-actualization, where the citizens say, no, democracy, politics starts with us. Again, in my last presentation here, because I use it in almost every presentation, just take the Greeks, the demos, the ordinary people. Quatia, the power, the authority of ordinary people. And you just heard Mr. Santo Domingo say, well, we went out and created the world that we wanted. Now, there are tensions there up against the protocol, the status quo world that exists. So acts of power, deeds, actualization, I would like for us to consider that while we live in societies, name any one on the planet Earth, where governance and governance institutions say, this is what we should be doing, this is our official identity, these are our official protocols, citizens are always pushing and saying, you know, I accept some of that, but I don't accept all of that. Gay, lesbian traditions, culture, not talking about sexuality now or sex, but that's one of the new democratic horizons that we need to examine. What does that mean about culture making, ways of knowing and doing? And what we see now is that the new democratic foundation in this society, and emerging in very tense ways in places like Uganda and other places, these are heritage questions as well that I would ask us to consider. I'm going to move very quickly, sort of indexing a few points because we don't have enough time, and I don't want to take enough time because I'm not sure I'm cogent enough today to fully elaborate on some of these. But I want to talk about acts of power, deeds. From which vantage point? Michelle Stefano has alluded to, well, she has actually emphasized the state and the role that the state plays in either national state or multilateral bodies of saying to citizens, we select this as representative of who we want you to be and who we want us to be a part of. And I will give a few examples of some radical departures within the state system. But I like to talk about from the vantage point of the citizen, because I work at the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage in this public trust called the Smithsonian Institution. And this institution, the Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, was established in 1967 for the express purpose of contrasting traditional museology, object-based learning, where we focus on the object, the power of the object. We seldom focus on who made the object, you know, beauties in the object and the gaze and so forth and so on. In a period in which the late Ralph Rensler, who founded the Festival of American Folklife, used to say, he was Jewish, he would say, well, where do you find the color folks? You find them in the National Museum of Natural History with the flora and the fauna. And what we did, he did, Bernice Johnson Reagan of Sweet Honey in the Rock and others, when the Folklife Festival was started, we brought ordinary people from local communities on the National Mall, this very resonant, resounding national platform where people go to protest this or stand for that. And we said, this is a platform for you to amplify your voice and to heighten your visibility. We can't give you voice. You have voice from the community. They know who you are. We may not hear you, we may not know of you, but they know who you are. So this whole thing about anonymous and heritage is something that I would also ask you to interrogate. So that we have been involved in that process of a bottom-up, a citizen perspective, in a struggle with the state and with traditional museology of how you go about it. Perhaps this is somewhat debatable because it has not been researched. The first real innovative museological development at the Smithsonian Institution, which goes back over 150 years now, is the Anacostia Community Museum. Anybody ever heard of that? It's in, I started to say Black Washington, but which is more now Vanilla Swirl, gentrifying Washington than Chocolate City that the people used to refer to the city as. Well, this was a group of black citizens, no museologists. I think for something like 18, 22 years, it did not have any museological protocols, and it was bring your objects, what makes you tick, what makes you feel good, and people brought them in. A black preacher, John Kennard, the late John Kennard, led that because he was really concerned about racism. The push and pull, that is when we look at the Philippine example that Mr. Domingo gave us, one is the deterioration, the displacement of culture, the fragmentation, the atomization of culture. But the other is, what are we going to do about it? That is the agency. And so what they decided to do about it was to come to the Smithsonian Institution, charge it in many ways with racism, and say, and we want to be a part of it. This is seemingly the paradox that I think we all go through from the vantage point of gender, class, rural, urban, black, white, whatever ethnic, cultural dimension. And so the critical part is very, very important, but the transformative part makes the whole. So critical, transformative gives us whole. I think you can look at any proposition in life, whether it's science or in the humanities, and we will be able to theorize and extract out that people stand back from what exists and critically observe it, and then they say, okay, somehow we got to do something about this. So the transformative dimension is one that I would like for you to think about. Let me go to a few acts of defining cultural power. One, I want to now look at a few state examples, because the state is problematic. Take any country in the world, and I travel quite a bit around the world, and some of the most interesting radical places like Cuba and Ecuador and Bolivia and Brazil and South Africa, where people are trying to envision new possibilities, and they are in very tense relationships with status quo notions of what democracy should be, citizenship should be, how states should operate. I want to start with a quick example of, I just found this last week, and when I started to read it, because I get these blocks in Latin America, it didn't sound like this was a cultural heritage thing. Then I thought, wow, this is quite fascinating. This comes from the movement of the landless people in Brazil. And this is a news report, the opening paragraph of which says, and I will not do it in Spanish, I'll just do it in English. Here is what, and this is a group of representatives talking about agrarian reform to President Dilma Rousseff, who is the president of Brazil, the seventh largest economy in the world, largest inhabitants of Afro-descendants outside of Nigeria. And they said, here is what we consider life. This is a basket they're presenting here, represented in our food, seeds, poems, crafts, and our symbols. Now let's talk about agrarian reform. There is an index to cultural heritage. First, let us tell you about our ways of knowing and being and sense-making, which is one of the simple orientations or definitions to culture. Now let's talk about some hardcore negotiation. So when we think about heritage and agency from the vantage point of the state, it comes in many different ways. I was in Ecuador 4 or 5 months ago and doing some things with indigenous people and the oil companies that have just spoiled their land, and took the opportunity to meet with the Minister of Culture, and I thought, well, let me go up and take a look at what their mission statement is. And I just want to read a few things about a different form of the state, because the state is, we can either stand outside the state and say, let them go their way. They have all of our resources, they do all of our taxes, they determine who goes to war, they determine what happens in the school system and so forth and so on. And we can romanticize localism. We all start somewhere locally, so you can't get outside of the local. But if we see the local as our only sort of framework, we're leaving all of the power for the expansion of imagination and qualitative impact on our lives in the state, and we're only exercising at local levels. We're leaving all of our financial resources and the accumulated power of our historical institutions, school systems, judicial systems, recreational systems, food systems, so forth, so on, to a group of people who have a culture that they inhabited called the state. And so I think the question is for the citizen is, how do we negotiate that in our interest and become the state in a matter of speaking in many, many different ways? And I want to give a quick few examples of some radical departures, radical meaning going to the root, but at the level of scale of a nation. So Ecuador has a lot of indigenous people, and it has this very sizable Afro-Ecuadorian population as well. So I made a quick translation. So here's a value statement from the Ministry of Culture and Heritage of Ecuador. The Constitution raises for the first time the need to establish systemic structure that meets the large cultural needs for the construction of a state and a society that is just, democratic, multinational, intercultural. Now read anything in the US government or the British government or the French government and see how you compare the possibilities of citizen activity vis-a-vis their representatives in the state and this kind of proposition. The mission statement, the Ministry of Culture and Heritage implements stewardship, not authority, stewardship. And that's a term that I would urge you to examine, of the national system of culture to strengthen national identity and multiculturalism, protect and promote the diversity of cultural expressions. I was involved from 1998 to 2003 in meetings all around the world with organized citizen cultural activists meeting with ministers of culture at least once a year to negotiate the Convention for the Promotion and the Protection of Cultural Diversity. This, again, was a developmental relation, or one might use the term a dialectical relation, but a developmental relation of citizens trying to move state perspectives where they want to move them. I was also involved in the intangible cultural heritage protocols in which Peter Seitel, who lives in the Washington metropolitan area, very important folklorist, who was brought to Turin, Italy, explicitly by UNESCO to frame a definition for intangible cultural heritage. I was asked to come along for the politics of it. Once we get this genre, which we like to study in universities and in cultural studies departments and museums, and talk about outside of the largest sociology of negotiating power, but once we get this, what are we going to do about it? So it was these kinds of questions of how do we work with people in the Philippines, or with the Lumbee from North Carolina, or with Black Americans, or with XYZ in local communities, to actually be proactive citizens, to use their agency to ensure that the state is measuring up to some of the things they want to do. Let me come to some closing comments now. So, since you're in the university and you have this precious, almost magical opportunity, for the most part, not totally, to suspend the realities of daily life. You can't totally suspend them because some of you have families and children and infirmed parents and second part-time jobs and so forth and so on. But you do really have a pristine, by way of comparison, kind of setting to do this. I would urge you to think from the individual to the community, to the local, to the global, and try to figure out what are the intersecting themes and not inhabit any of those in and of themselves. Why? Because as I alluded to earlier, we live in a transnational world, not just a global world. I heard someone this morning talk about a post-topographical community. I'm a troglodyte who knows little about Twitter or Facebook or any of those things, but the notions of communities set up through cell phones and other kinds of social media. These are considerations that I urge you to be active about, proactive citizens in constructing heritage and having to state to facilitate the kinds of things that you do and not get trapped or isolated in a simple genre or a simple thematic issue and feel that because you're in an insular community, either as a cultural heritage professional as I am, or in a museum, or in a particular department, that somehow that is the world in which you live. It is not. You can live there and be very happy and retire there, actually, in a nice pension for the rest of your life. But the larger questions of life-defining questions of what is good, truth, and beautiful, and what are the material circumstances of life, and how your cultural ways of knowing come to deal with that, you will have excluded yourself for it, because they are operating in local jurisdictions, the Baltimore City Council or the Washington, D.C. Council, or the governor of a particular state, or a president, or a State Department, or a multilateral organization like UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you to all, Mario and Ashley. Really, I think you brought up some great points to spark some discussions. So, any questions or comments or thoughts? Anything sparked?
I guess I'll just speak up while the mic is so my name is Ian Brown from the Language, Literature, and Culture PhD program, and I'm just going to throw out a question just to get us going in terms of digesting this wonderful information that we just got. A wonderful portrayal of heritage from the local all the way to the more macro level, and then bring it back again. So the question that I have in my mind is, and one that I've been wrestling with for some time, is early on, Dr. Stefano put forward the exercise of thinking of the words that come to mind when we think of heritage. And the words that came up were words like culture, tradition, ethnicity, roots, and there were a couple others. So I guess the question I put out is, what are the connections, the intersections between these concepts in relation to the idea, the process of heritage, and yeah, and I guess I'll just throw that out there to our fellow panelists and everybody else in here.
No thoughts? Anyone up here would like to take a stab at the intersections of these different
Yeah.
concepts that have
Yeah.
come up?
Their connections with heritage. Because for a moment, culture and heritage could seem almost synonymous, just for a moment, until you think about it a little further.
Quick moment.
Yeah, quick moment, yeah.
Well, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
To that point, I think it's almost seamless, and at least in my experience, and as a Lumbee, I have to say, we don't compartmentalize. It's all part of our way of being. All of those categories, all of those things. Language, we do have a dialect of English, food, singing, place, all of it, it's all together. That's it.
What comes to my mind is the notion of inheritance. So with culture, roots, ancestry, what have you, these are things that are passed down. Knowledge are things that help us to form our personal identity, but also connect us to others in a more collective identity. So I would think that is the one big connection to heritage. I mean, in many languages, particularly Latin-based languages, heritage is known as patrimony, which literally means what we inherit today from the past.
I think in a very little sense, looking at the two terms, cultural heritage, I suggested that we are culture makers. Culture is not, in the first instance, something out there. And there is a tradition, if you will, in academic studies and in cultural policy within local and national jurisdictions to sort of talk about culture as something external. And also to make culture more synonymous with notions of the arts than it is an anthropological notion of culture, which are all of the things that a particular group of people produces. So one of the things that you will not hear a lot about, but is quite fundamentally important when we talk about heritage, are knowledge systems, agricultural knowledge systems. They were not written down. The implements had art on them. They were functional. They were basic survival issues, not just spiritual well-being. That is one consideration. And I think when we talk about ethnicity, struggle, and some of the, what I would say, not synonyms, but connected terms that we hear to heritage, I think we should go back to what Michelle has started with, and that is, there is an authority inferred in the term that this is your birthright, be you Afro-Latino, be you Lumbee, be you gay, be you straight, be you Guatemalan, whatever. This is the protocol. This is the template that you should act like, almost as though it was a biological imperative, that the color of my skin is more or less the same as the color of everybody whose blood has mixed to carry under the name early. But that's not who I'm synonymous with. But that's what the protocols say. So I think we need to interrogate the terms and look at culture as really the qualifying term, and heritage is what is selected by the generation generally before us to say that this is where you come from. Now, we don't talk about male chauvinism, prostitution, racism. Those are ways of knowing and doing as well. Those came out of people's imagination, moved from their imagination to actual sociological arrangements. So we tend to talk about culture in a positive way, as though it did not have any other dimensions. And I think your generation, young colleagues in the audience particularly, need to explode these terms. In fact, I think you are.
So I was very interested in the whole, the presentation of the Lumbee heritage movement, because it also brings up this whole question of the invention of tradition. And that seems to be something that you're embracing in a way in your programs. So, I mean, in that sense, I mean, heritage we think of as something that's, patrimony, that's, set, coming down through generations. But when you invent traditions, how does that, how does that affect the whole idea of heritage? is one question that I had for you. And the other question was, what would be your relationship of the group that you've created, the community you've created, with something like the Native American Museum in DC, the Smithsonian Native American Museum? Would you be interested in kind of having a representation there, or is it something that you feel like the local can't really, sort of mesh with the national without some sort of compromises being made that you might not really feel comfortable with?
So again, our culture has been particularly embracing of some other traditions. If you think about it, contact with Europeans and other populations happened on the East Coast first, so the tribes up and down the coast have added in other traditions, and then you see pan-Indianism, like if you recall the dancers at the powwow and their grass dance outfits. That's a dance that was, it's first of all it's contemporary, and second of all it comes from the Great Plains. So and the eagle feather ceremony, while we also the eagle has spiritual significance traditionally all the way back for our people. There's things that Native people do across the Americas as part of pan-Indianism, which is kind of borrowing from each other's cultures, and there are over 500 of them. I think also different aspects of that book, The Lumbee Problem. The author did a lot of work making arguments about what makes the Lumbee a group, period. And some of our dominant cultural traits are actually ways we have Lumbeefied other people's things, like English, or the way we speak English. There's actually a Lumbee English dictionary, it's not a joke. But if you ever visit the church, it's happened where people have visited the church, which is a Christian church, and heard the preacher preaching and thought he was speaking in tongues, and it's actually just a thick Lumbee accent from North Carolina. So it's all additive. It's all part of who we are now. As far as representation at NMAI, we're actually fairly well represented in the employees. The guy working the front desk is a Locklear, which is a Lumbee last name. But I think throughout the whole museum, there's about 3 instances of Lumbee imagery or culture. I know we have some baskets, and then that part where you walk through and it's real-time video of natives. There's some Lumbee people pictured there. We would like more representation. We were there for the grand opening. This goes into Indian politics about state recognized versus federally recognized versus terminated. It's just a whole nother can of worms, but we're there.
I would also say, Perminda, that you bring up this concept of authenticity, all right? And what's authentic? What if it's new? If it doesn't have such a long-standing tradition, can it be recognized as heritage? Again, it goes back to who's deciding, right? If a tradition is seen as not old enough or what have you, again, it's the body who's deciding. If that's not a problem for us as a community, a group, a bunch of individuals, and then that's fine then. But then as you get higher up in the more institutionalized heritage organizations and system, that can be a problem. So.
First question. I have a question about, we're looking ahead to the future for preserving today's culture. It seems like artifacts of today's culture are becoming more and more digitized. So how do you feel that what are some methods you think that could be used to preserve such cultural artifacts of today's era and maybe in the future?
You're talking about digital, born digital things, so to speak.
Digital natives.
Right. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is the future. Whenever you're talking 5, 10 years, I wonder if the technology will change that we can't even access some of these things anymore. That's a big worry within the digitization movement or that you know, the technological debates that go around archives and museums and heritage and history, historical societies, etc. So I mean, I don't know how to answer your question, but you know, there's a joke, not that I'm in some like secret society, but there's this joke in heritage that we have so much heritage, and every day there's more and more heritage because we're recognizing and protecting and safeguarding so much and categorizing that, you know, we'll never run out of heritage. But yeah, I mean, that's a great question, just thinking of all the born digital aspects of our history and culture that we're producing today. It's just never ending. Good luck to the archivist or what have you, the person behind the computer.
You know, again, I would ask you to interrogate some of these terms, starting with what many argue, and I think is the general consensus, that history is the bedrock of the humanities. Everything takes place in time and space. So something just happened a second ago, but it does not mean that anybody in this room will recall it tomorrow. But something just happened a second ago that some of you will be talking about this evening, talking about tomorrow, not because we are very important people, but it was the resonance of the idea. But the idea may not have originated with any of us. We may not even know where it came from. So one of the questions, it seems to me, about heritage that we need to look at is, how does it help a group of people or a society cohere over a long period of time? And then I think we have to interrogate this notion that somehow tradition is forever. I mean, the world has been around a very, very long time, and I suspect, notwithstanding global warming and the cataclysmic elements that still may hit us, we'll probably be mutants from that, and that there will be some remnants of who we were as a human population today that is going to go on. So I don't buy into the fully doomsday theory, which goes to the digital question. So we have digital libraries. I mean, there's a whole science of libraryship and whatnot that has been extended. But one of the other challenges, I think, for every society is that we tend to look in the mirror and it reflects where we are at the moment. And we don't start to think about, well, I have great-great-great-grandparents, where all of this heritage stuff is supposed to have come from. And why would not I think that there is going to be a great extended future, generational future? And I would ask you to consider this. One of my other standard props in these kinds of discussions is that this is going to be seen as a clunky, unbelievably burdensome kind of thing, because already your generation of young adults in the room, some of you may already have it. You're getting implants. You know, people can get a little thing embedded in their hands and turn on the lights in their house as they approach or open up. So nanotechnology, which are extensions of our imagination and of what our imagination has produced in earlier generations, and we are seemingly in a period where we are going to smaller is bigger, qualitatively more power, fissions, things of that sort. And one of the long-range things is this, you'll be around for a long time to see this, but this morphology that we are in, called the body, I think we're going to see a period in your generation where giving birth, I mean, we already know what in vitro insemination is, but giving birth may be going into a store and two people blowing into a bag and saying, actually, what kinds of physical traits and so forth and so on you want, and coming back. That won't obviate sex, I hope, but I hope that sentient dimension of humanity will stay there. But I'm just suggesting that don't just think in the immediacy of the moment. Try to extrapolate where things are going, and what does this have to do with the notion of heritage, of accumulated perspectives and ways of knowing and doing that cohere. And we know that there are ruptures that people break from that. So who is an African American in the United States in the 21st century when we now have 3 or 4 generations of African citizens, not immigrants, not resident green card holders, but who are citizens, who look like me, but who do not carry the same emotional profile as me. And my emotional profile does not come from my genetic structure. It comes from the historical time and engagement that I'm in. So all of these are factors, I think, to be brought into heritage.
I'd also like to go back to this notion of heritage as a process and to bring your wonderful examples up. You know, my personal subfield within heritage that I research is alternative museology. So very similar to the work that you guys are both involved with and are guiding this notion that we're going to tell our own stories. And if we divorce ourselves from this somewhat neurosis that we must preserve and protect for the future, and just in a way enjoy the time we have together to work together in these heritage projects. Not that the future and preservation isn't important, but it's the #1 priority within the heritage discourse and idea. But if we were to realize that this may just be a generational project, this eco-museum in Brazil or the community museum in Morone, that may free you up to enjoy the process and maybe talking about the benefits of well-being and mental health and building what is, I argue, most important, senses of community, belonging, pride, and ownership, and all, you know, all the positive things that can come out of that, versus the products that we're saving for the future. You know, just to, in a way, deprioritize this preservation aspect and to see it more as it can just be a generational process that may die. You know, you have to have people to value the project, the program, whatever you want to call it, the museum. And if you can't force people to value a cultural tradition, you can't force people to stay in their village and make baskets instead of becoming anthropologists, doctors, and nurses. So we do have to start realizing that death is very much a part of heritage. It's the larger ecology of understanding human cultural expression, so that, you know, in a way, I just feel that may free us up to really understand the benefits of what heritage can offer.
Okay, we have time for one short question here, and then for the last one.
I remember y'all mentioned a concept of material versus living, what was it, living culture. How do you, I mean, I'm used to the material culture. I've been to a lot of museums. But how do you go about showcasing living culture? Like, I remember y'all mentioned food and dance. How do y'all display that when stuff like food is like more of a sensory experience? Stuff like dance is like, you know, is better perceived when you actually see it in action. How do y'all display that?
That's right. Our plan is to allot maybe a quarter of the space to the living component. You know, we will have sessions where we invite local chefs, for example, in terms of food and cooking, to demonstrate actual preparation of food, where people will join in the process of actually preparing, for example, adobo. It's the Filipino food. So with all the attendant senses involved, visual, tactile, gustatory, so that people will have total experience inside the museum. So at the same time, we plan to have continuous activities that would involve old people, for example, telling stories about their childhood. We realized that there's a small group of people in Morone who sings Japanese children's songs because they were like 7 or 6 years old during World War II, and there were Japanese soldiers actually teaching them how to sing those songs. So these are part of the living, what we call the living heritage. It's there. We can't just have artifacts inside the museum, because we thought that it should be more interactive. You know, a museum should be a place where people will find opportunities to interact, form relationships, and somehow move toward something greater than what they used to have, you know, in terms of experience, cultural experience.
Okay, you want to say something?
Just Very quickly, and I promise this will be my last comment. I think Michelle, Stefano, and I are going to try to formulate something at some point in some kind of project, and
We already know.
of an extended project, and I think we may bring two vantage points that are headed to hopefully a very fruitful debate in which we agree on many elements and people who work around us, but which I want to suggest some things to be tracked. If you look at the process in Latin America today, the political process, and it's probably perhaps the most dynamic region in the world measured by some criteria at a political level, they're trying to break from deregulation, privatization, lower role of the state and the welfare of the citizen, notions of participatory democracy rather than representative democracy. And the projects are the search for alternatives within the existing system, but also the search for transformation, plural transformation. One example of that is in Bolivia, there is now a Ministry of Nature. And that the discussion of nature in many of these Latin American nations now is nature is not something apart, it is everything and we are part of it. That is a systemic, potentially, derivation. Alternatives. I think one of the limitations, and I think we should enjoy and deal with alternatives, but one of the limitations is that other powers are taking intangible cultural heritage, and intangible cultural heritage arose as a political statement because in the West they valued materiality. But in many communities of color, which we use as a big metaphor, somewhat a problematic metaphor, words, the oral tradition, the spirits, the ancestors. The debate in the Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian was repatriation of these bones, and the Native people said, these are not bones, these are ancestors. Then it opens up the issue of deaccessioning rooms, you know, where you decide you're going to take objects out of your collection and you put your little gloves on, and it's seen as a kind of, you know, neutral kind of thing. Well, when different cosmologies, different ways of knowing comes into the space, in some societies, women are not supposed to see certain objects. Our children are not supposed to see certain objects. Our men are not supposed to see. Those are then epistemological knowledge issues, which changes the whole construction and opens up whole new systemic possibilities. And that's, so I want you to enjoy, but I want you to know that there are powers to be. Language, to the young lady's question who raised it, language is a very important issue because language is an index for Monsanto to go into the Amazon and talk to a native person and give her or him $25, which may be more than they will see in 2 years, and say, I want you to name every plant, give me the indigenous name, then they're going to put our terminology on it, tell us what you use it for, and then we're going to go and, they don't tell them this, we're going to go and copyright it because you're into this collective discussion that you all own it. I'm into an intellectual property right. So there are huge stakes here. There are certain language groups in West Africa where computer companies are studying their cognitive patterns. These are not biological patterns. These are ways of knowing and doing expressed in the complexity of language. And I'll stop on this point. My generation often sort of jokingly said, you know, the Eskimo, who we now call Inuits, talking about tradition and change of tradition, have 9 different words for snow. Well, we thought that was really interesting and funny, and but why would they not have 12 different words for snow when that is the characteristic environment in which they live, that they have to engage, and words as symbols of reality, and where these may be life-defining moments between what we call sleet and rain, may be a history of accumulated knowledge, heritage, that a certain kind of snow is an indication that in 3 months we're going to have floods. So there are really consequential things here about intellectual property rights, about what we are being sold, about what we can eat. And these come basically from grassroots communities who have produced these knowledge systems, not just these interesting dances and carvings and whatnot, that I think we over-endow when we talk about heritage. So real cultural politic, that is, culture is, as UNESCO says, is transversal. It is no longer, as the State Department likes to argue, it is soft power. Look at all of the conflicts in the world. What are they about? They're about how long is your dress and what do you have over your face? That is an aesthetic but very powerful discussion. it is, what is that language? Does that sound Arabic? Is that a terrorist? These are consequential, life-defining issues, even as they are issues that we should enjoy. So, real cultural politic, transversal culture cuts through all life-defining issues: climate, war, peace, gender relationships, so forth and so on. And art and knowledge systems and languages are playing a very important role. So that while you may specialize in a museological issue or a topical issue of dress and paintings and so forth and so on, do not lose sight of the larger consequential issues, because there are groups of people in corporations and in states and in militaries where anthropologists are being embedded to pacify populations after invasion. We are about to do a project of how do you work with militaries to instruct them in cultural ways of knowing and doing. How do we prevent or lower the level of conflict so that we don't have an occupied Israel or something of that sort. So these are really, really consequential questions, this area of heritage and culture, and no longer just sort of the soft dimensions as my generation has been instructed.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Unfortunately, we don't have more time, but we can continue the conversation in the reception area. Thank you very much.
Thank you.